He mocked soldiers. Then Stallone revealed his dad was one. Welcome to Stallone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. What started as a routine keynote address at a prestigious high school career day would, in the course of a single, explosive hour, become a permanent lesson etched into the memory of every person present. The setting was the hallowed auditorium of Northwood Preparatory Academy, a place that smelled of old wood polish and the quiet ambition of the nation's future elite. The air was thick with the restless energy of teenagers, a sea of uniformed students whose polite attention barely concealed their desire to be anywhere else. On the stage, under the warm, forgiving glow of the theatrical lights, sat Sylvester Stallone. He was not there to promote a film, but as a favor to the principal, an old acquaintance. He was the day's surprise speaker, a figure of quiet authority in a simple, well-tailored blazer, his presence a stark contrast to the parade of investment bankers and corporate lawyers who had preceded him. His message was simple, direct, and from the heart. It was about perseverance, about the grit required to turn rejection into fuel, and about the quiet dignity of hard work. He was a picture of earned wisdom, a man who had fought his battles and now sat comfortably with his scars. In the third row, a king in his own adolescent kingdom, slouched Ethan Thorne. He was everything Northwood Prep prided itself on producing. Handsome, intelligent, athletic, and possessed of an unshakable, almost blinding self-confidence. He was the captain of the debate team, the star quarterback, a young man who had never encountered an obstacle he couldn't talk his way over or push his way through. He listened to Stallone with a look of faint, bored amusement, his thumbs flying across the screen of his phone, his attention a galaxy away. The initial interactions were placid, a familiar dance of polite questions and thoughtful answers. The students, impressed despite themselves by the presence of a true icon, asked about Hollywood, about the craft of acting, about the genesis of Rocky. Stallone was gracious, humble, and engaging. The calm, however, was a fragile veneer, and it was about to be shattered by the thoughtless venom of youthful arrogance. The shift from a placid Q&A session to a tense, moral confrontation began with a single, earnest question from a girl in the front row. "Mr. Stallone," she asked, her voice nervous but clear, "my brother is in the Marines. What do you think is the most important quality for a soldier?" Stallone's face softened. He leaned forward, the avuncular storyteller taking over. He spoke of courage, not just the physical kind, but the moral courage to do the right thing when no one is watching. He spoke of discipline, the kind that forges character in the crucible of adversity. He spoke of sacrifice, the willingness to put the needs of the group, of the nation, ahead of one's own. It was a heartfelt, respectful answer, and a wave of appreciative silence washed over the auditorium. But in the third row, that silence was broken by a sound. It was a soft, but distinctly audible scoff, a puff of derisive air from Ethan Thorne. Then, he stood up, grabbing the student microphone from the aisle proctor with an air of entitled impatience. He didn't wait to be called on. "With all due respect, Mr. Stallone," he began, his voice dripping with a condescension that was anything but respectful. "Aren't you romanticizing it a little? I mean, being a soldier seems pretty easy to me." A shocked murmur rippled through the students. The principal, a mild-mannered man named Mr. Davison, looked as though he had just swallowed a hornet. Ethan, however, was just warming up, basking in the sudden, sharp focus of 1,000 pairs of eyes. "You just follow orders. You get to play with cool gear, work out all day. It's basically a video game with a paycheck for guys who couldn't get into a good college." The inciting incident had arrived, a statement of such profound, breathtaking ignorance that it sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Stallone's warm, open expression didn't vanish, but it froze. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his posture. He sat up straighter, his jaw tightened, and his eyes, which had been soft and engaging, hardened into chips of cold, analytical flint. The auditorium was now palpably tense, the air thick with the students' shocked silence and the principal's radiating panic. Mr. Davison started to rise, to intervene, but Stallone gave him a subtle, almost invisible shake of the head. "Not yet. Stallone, a master of pacing both on screen and off, knew this couldn't be shut down. It had to be dismantled piece by painful piece. He kept his voice even, a model of restraint. "That's an interesting perspective, Ethan," he said, the use of the boy's first name a quiet assertion of control. "But a video game has a reset button. There's no reset button for a roadside bomb. There's no respawning when you lose a brother in a firefight." Ethan, however, was not there for a debate. He was there to perform, to demonstrate his own intellectual superiority. He saw Stallone's calm response not as a sign of strength, but as an opening. "That's just semantics," he shot back, waving a dismissive hand. "The point is, it's a structured, simple life. You're told what to do, where to go. You're not building a business. You're not creating wealth. You're not dealing with the complex pressures of the real world." He was probing, pushing, mischaracterizing military service as a simple, thoughtless profession, a refuge for the unambitious. He was now deliberately contrasting it with the world of his father, a world of commerce and high-stakes finance that he viewed as the only true arena of struggle and success. The tension escalated. The students were no longer just shocked. They were enthralled, watching a live-action collision of two completely different worlds. They could feel the ground shifting, the quiet respect of the assembly curdling into something confrontational and ugly. Stallone's composure remained, but it was now the composure of a coiled snake. He was listening, absorbing, letting Ethan build his own coffin with every arrogant word. The air on stage seemed to cool, the warm lights now feeling like the cold, interrogating glare of a spotlight. Ethan Thorne, high on the adrenaline of his own audacity, doubled down on his aggressive line of attack. He was now the self-appointed prosecutor of an entire class of people, with Sylvester Stallone as their unwitting defense attorney. "I hear all this talk about PTSD and all these other issues," Ethan said, making air quotes with his fingers around the acronym, a gesture of profound disrespect. "And it just sounds like an excuse. It sounds like a justification for people who couldn't hack it in a high-pressure environment and now want the world to feel sorry for them. My dad works in private equity. He handles $100 million deals. He sleeps 4 hours a night. That's pressure. That's real hard work. He's building something. What does a soldier build?" It was this comparison, this smug, ignorant hierarchy of human endeavor that finally caused Stallone to begin his principled stand. He didn't erupt. His voice remained steady, but a new, harder edge entered it, a tone of righteous indignation that was impossible to ignore. "He builds a perimeter," Stallone said, his voice cutting through the silence. "In the middle of the night, in a country where everything that moves might be trying to kill him, he builds a wall of sandbags and concertina wire. And he stands on that wall so that men like your father can sleep for 4 hours a night and dream of their $100 million deals." The direct, stark contrast hit the audience with the force of a physical blow. A few students gasped. Ethan's smirk faltered for the first time. Stallone wasn't just arguing a point anymore. He was painting a picture of two vastly different realities. He was beginning to systematically expose the hollow, privileged core of the boy's argument. He was no longer on the defensive. He was now on the attack, armed not with anger, but with the unassailable power of truth. The breaking point, the final, fatal miscalculation by Ethan Thorne, came when he tried to reclaim the moral high ground by Leoneizing his father at the expense of all others. He felt the tide turning against him, saw the looks on his classmates' faces, and his arrogance curdled into a desperate, defensive declaration. "My father is a hero," Ethan stated, his voice ringing with a conviction born of a lifetime of privilege. "He's a success. He built his company from nothing. He didn't need to join the army as some kind of last resort, some safety net for people with no other options." The insult was total. It dismissed the service of millions as a choice made from a lack of better prospects. It was the final, unforgivable straw. It was the moment that pushed Sylvester Stallone beyond the realm of debate and into the realm of profound, personal revelation. He stood up from his chair. The movement was slow, deliberate, and it commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the auditorium. He walked to the very edge of the stage, the warm lights casting a long shadow over the front rows. He looked down, not at the entire student body, but directly at Ethan Thorne, who stood frozen at the microphone, suddenly looking much smaller. Stallone's voice, when he spoke, was not loud. It was a quiet, almost intimate tone, yet it filled the vast, silent hall. "You're right about one thing, son," he began, the word son carrying a weight of both pity and admonition. "Your father is a hero." He paused, letting the affirmation hang in the air, a moment of false hope for the boy. Then came the climax of the confrontation, a question that would change the boy's life forever. But not for the reasons you think. Stallone's gaze was like a physical weight. "What's your father's name?" he asked. Confused but still defiant, Ethan answered, "Robert Thorne." Stallone nodded slowly, a look of deep, ancient sorrow in his eyes. "I know," he said softly. "I know Robert Thorne. I served with him." The three words, "I served with him," detonated in the silent auditorium with the force of a bomb. A collective, audible gasp swept through the student body. Ethan Thorne's face, which had been a mask of arrogant defiance, crumpled. The blood drained from it, leaving a sickly, pale canvas of pure, unadulterated shock. He staggered back a step, his hand gripping the microphone stand for support. His entire world, his entire understanding of his father, of himself, had just been vaporized. Stallone, standing at the edge of the stage, had seized a moral high ground, and from that unassailable peak, he began to rain down the terrible, beautiful truth. He was no longer speaking to just Ethan. He was speaking to the entire assembly, a storyteller weaving a tale of forgotten sacrifice. "Your father, Robert Thorne," Stallone began, his voice low and resonant, "was not in private equity when I knew him. He was Sergeant Thorne, United States Army Rangers. And he was the toughest, bravest man in a platoon full of tough, brave men." Stallone's eyes seemed to look past the auditorium walls, back into a time and place of smoke and fire. "You asked what a soldier builds? Let me tell you what your father built. He built a bridge of covering fire over 3 of his wounded men during an ambush in the Karengal Valley. He ran into a storm of lead that would have made a god flinch, and he carried his radio operator, a kid from Ohio who was no older than you are now, 100 yards on his back to a medevac chopper, all while taking shrapnel in his leg and his shoulder." He paused, his gaze returning to the shattered boy in the third row. "You're right. He works 80-hour weeks, but not because he's a titan of industry. He works because if he ever stops, if he ever gets quiet, the only thing he can hear is the sound of that chopper leaving and the voices of the men who didn't make it." The condemnation of Ethan's ignorance was absolute, but it was delivered as a tribute to his father's honor. "The reason your father never told you these stories," Stallone concluded, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "the reason he let you believe he was just a businessman is because he did all of that so you would never have to. He endured a nightmare so you could have a dream. He fought a war so you could have the luxury of standing here in this safe, beautiful school and be this profoundly, tragically foolish." Having delivered the life-altering truth, Stallone knew his purpose at Northwood Preparatory Academy was complete. There was nothing more to say. The lesson had been delivered, not as a lecture, but as a lightning strike of revelation. His definitive action was not one of anger or triumph, but of profound, solemn finality. He looked at Ethan Thorne, who was now openly weeping, his face buried in his hands, his entire body shaking with the force of his sobs. Stallone's expression was not one of satisfaction, but of deep, aching sorrow for the boy's lost innocence, for the father's hidden pain, and for the vast, silent gulf that had existed between them. He turned away from the broken teenager and faced the stunned and silent Principal Davison. "I think," Stallone said, his voice quiet but firm, "that's all I have to say." He walked back to the chair he had been sitting in, picked up his simple blazer, and draped it over his arm. He gave a single, final nod to the silent, watching students, a gesture that was both a farewell and an unspoken plea for them to remember what they had just heard. Then, without a backward glance, Without waiting for the principal's stammered thanks or the audience's stunned applause, he walked off the stage, disappearing into the wings. His exit was not a walk-off of anger, but a withdrawal of immense gravity. He had entered the school as a celebrity. He left it as a historian, a truth-teller, a man who had repaid an old debt to a fellow soldier by giving his son the most painful and necessary gift of his life, his father's story. The moral victory was absolute, and its power was in its quiet, devastating grace. The moment Stallone vanished from the stage, the auditorium was left in a state of profound, suspended shock. The only sound was the heartbreaking, gut-wrenching sobs of Ethan Thorne, a sound that seemed to fill every corner of the vast, silent hall. No one moved. No one spoke. The students, who had moments before seen Ethan as an arrogant, untouchable king, now saw him for what he was, a boy who had just discovered the immense, hidden weight of the ground he had been walking on his entire life. Principal Davison, his face pale and his hands trembling, stumbled to the podium. He opened his mouth to dismiss the assembly, but no words came out. He simply looked out at the sea of young, stunned faces, and then at the broken boy in the third row, and shook his head, a gesture of overwhelming sadness and awe. Several of Ethan's friends, the ones who had been snickering along with him, now looked horrified. Two of them rose tentatively, went to Ethan, and put their hands on his shaking shoulders, a clumsy but sincere attempt at comfort. It was a small, significant sign that the lesson of the day had hit its mark. The students weren't just processing a celebrity takedown. They were processing a fundamental shift in their understanding of the world. They were learning in real time about the silent sacrifices that underpin their comfortable lives. The atmosphere was not one of humiliation for the antagonist, but of a shared, communal reckoning. There was no applause for the protagonist's victory, only a deep, somber, and transformative silence, a silence that was more powerful than any ovation. It was the sound of 1,000 young minds recalibrating their definition of the word hero. The story of what happened at Northwood Prep didn't leak out. It poured. Dozens of students, their hands still shaking, began texting their parents and posting on social media. A parent who had been volunteering at the back of the auditorium had filmed the entire exchange. The video, raw and unfiltered, was uploaded to the internet, and it became an immediate global phenomenon. But this was a different kind of viral moment. It wasn't about schadenfreude or public shaming. It was a deeply emotional and complex story that resonated with millions. Hashtag Stallone story and hashtag Robert Thorne became trending topics, but the conversation was nuanced and overwhelmingly respectful. It was a story about the hidden wounds of war, the gulf between generations, and the fierce, protective love of a father. News outlets across the country picked up the story, not as a celebrity takedown, but as a powerful human interest piece. They tracked down other members of Robert Thorne's platoon, who confirmed the story of his heroism, adding their own tales of his courage and leadership. Robert Thorne himself was thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight. He was a man who had spent 2 decades building a new life, a new identity to wall off the old one. After a day of silence, his company released a simple, powerful statement. It confirmed the story, expressed profound gratitude to his brother Sly, and ended with a simple, heartbreaking line. The greatest mission of my life has been to be a father. I now have to go and see how I've done. The public fallout was a wave of empathy. It sparked a national conversation about veteran parents and the children they try to shield from their past. Support groups for families of veterans saw a massive influx of interest. The story wasn't about a bully getting his comeuppance. It was about a son finally learning the truth of his father's love. In the months that followed, the legacy of that 1 hour in a high school auditorium continued to grow and evolve. For Ethan Thorne, the experience was a crucible that burned away his youthful arrogance and forged a new man. The reconciliation with his father was long, painful, and ultimately profoundly healing. They spoke for the first time not as a successful businessman and his privileged son, but as 2 men trying to understand the legacy of a war. Ethan, Humbled and transformed, changed his entire life path. He abandoned his plans for a career on Wall Street and instead dedicated himself to service, creating a foundation that helped the children of combat veterans connect with their parents' stories in a supportive, therapeutic environment. Robert Thorne, by being forced to confront his past, found a new kind of peace. He began speaking to his son, and then to other groups, about his experiences, realizing that sharing his story was not a burden, but a way to honor the men he had lost and to help the families of those who had survived. Sylvester Stallone never spoke of the incident again. When asked, he would simply say, "I just told a story about a friend." His refusal to take credit for the profound healing he had facilitated only deepened the public's respect for his character. He had become, in that moment, a living embodiment of the quiet strength he so often portrayed on screen. The ultimate lesson from that day at Northwood Prep was a complex and beautiful one. It was a story that taught an entire generation that the loudest voices are not always the strongest, and that the most important histories are often the ones that are never told. It was a reminder that the world is built on the foundations of silent sacrifice, and that the greatest honor we can pay to our heroes is to simply, finally, listen to their stories.